Trisha Mullins, and my partner on our project is Carolyn Mullins. We are not related. But today we would like to present to you about common formative assessments, and we would like to empower you to put this into place at your own school, in your own PLC, and all to benefit our students and to make our teaching practices more effective. Before we go any further, we should establish what a common formative assessment is, and we should have a common language to discuss what that is. And that's also something that you will need to do with your PLC, is to sit down and discuss what you all mean by common formative assessment so that everyone is on the same page when they say it and when you discuss it. The first item is that it must be collaboratively designed by a grade level or department team. So for my case, I am a German and Spanish teacher. I teach middle and high school German and Spanish. So for me, my grade level or department team is going to be my world language department. So we would create that together. You also have to consider, when are you going to do this? My district has set aside a time for collaboration. Once a month, we have what's called a late arrival day, and the students come an hour late, and that is time for us to work in our PLCs and collaborate and align. So that would be a good time for us to do that. So you need to consider, when would be a good time for you to do that with your group. So after you've created your common formative assessments for a particular unit, for example, then you're going to administer those to the students when the time comes. Really quickly, I want to address independence within your classroom. Remember that common formative assessments are not given every day. You are doing those independently in your own classroom using your own teaching methods, but the common assessments can be done throughout the year as frequently as you and your PLC decide, perhaps 4 times per year, perhaps twice a unit. That's really up to you all. But remember that feedback, as we will address soon, does need to be frequent. So I'd like to give you an example of this. I am a world language teacher. I teach German and Spanish. And one of the teaching methods that I really prefer and appreciate is called total physical response and total physical response storytelling. And in this teaching method, students respond to my words and commands with actions and motions. So we learn motions to go to specific words. We then turn these into stories, and we do storytelling within our classroom. So that's a formative assessment that I use in my classroom, but of course that's not a common formative assessment. So in order to have a common formative assessment, I'm going to have to plan that with my colleagues. Unfortunately, my colleagues don't use TPR, so I am going to have to find another method to assess my students for a common formative assessment because they don't use TPR. So we want to find common ground on which to base our common formative assessment. So a really good activity would be a dialogue that our students write and give. So let's assume that we are making a common formative assessment based on a dialogue which would assess interpersonal speaking in which 2 people are talking. Then we would need to create a rubric so that we would get to our last bullet point here, which is that we have to score this assessment together, analyze the results, and discuss student achievement together collaboratively. Because remember, just like a summative assessment can be compared to an autopsy, a formative assessment is more like an annual wellness checkup to see how things are going. But from that, you take the results and you do better, you improve. And I hope you can see that common formative assessments don't impede on your individuality and independence as a teacher. I can still use my teaching methods in TPR on a daily basis if I need to, but when we do common formative assessments, then I find common ground with my colleagues. Now that we're clear on what common formative assessments are, we should consider the data that we're going to be collecting during these assessments. So why do we collect data and why do we assess our students? We need to gather evidence of their achievement to inform our instructional practices, and we also need to be able to motivate their learning through our feedback and the data that we collect. So the data that we are collecting during these formative assessments should enable you to give feedback that is timely, specific, descriptive, and frequent. So if I created a common formative assessment with my German 1 teaching partner, we would make sure that the data would allow us to give feedback that encompasses all of these traits. So we would want to make sure that we were able to give timely feedback to our students, because if Johnny isn't good at having a conversation about this, I need to be able to tell him very specifically what he needs to do better and as fast as possible so that he can improve before our summative assessment, for example, and before he gets even further behind. I'm going to be very clear with him and very descriptive in those things that I say about what he needs to improve upon and how he can do it. And of course, this feedback does need to be frequent. So you need to make sure that you are giving feedback to your students on a regular basis, not just, that's why we don't just do summative assessments. We're going to make sure it's frequent as possible. So I've been discussing, what if I created a common formative assessment with my German 1 teaching partner to assess our students' interpersonal speaking skills, that is, two students having a dialogue. And so let's say that we are going to assess their ability and their skills at making plans with one another. That's a really important topic in German 1, is can they invite people to do something and discuss time, place, who, what, where, when, all of that. And so let's say that we are creating an assessment in which two students are making plans. So I'm going to go through 5 essential questions that you're going to ask yourself about your common formative assessments to make sure that your assessment is effective and valuable on your students' learning. So let's take my example and apply it to these questions. And so hopefully when you create a common formative assessment, you're keeping these questions in mind to make sure that what you're doing is truly valuable for your kids. So let's look at these 5 essential questions. Number 1, do they help our team identify students who are experiencing learning difficulties? This assessment would do that for me, because I could see who isn't able to make these plans with their classmate, who's unable to respond, who isn't using the vocabulary, who has a weird sentence structure. So I'll see the problems that they're having and I'll be able to address them. Number 2, do we have a plan in place to provide those students with additional time and support for learning? We actually, in my school, have a built-in time for this. It's called focus time. It's during the day. About 35 minutes per day is allotted to this, and it's a time for intervention or enrichment for our students. So we have that built into our schedule, so that's totally taken care of. 3, do we provide students with another opportunity to demonstrate their learning? Yes, we would give them time during our focus time to show their learning to us again. So that is already built into our schedule, like we've discussed. Number 4, do the results provide me with useful information to help identify areas where my students are not doing well? This dialogue, I think, surely would do that. I could identify whether grammar, word order, fluidity of speaking, those would be things I'd be looking for, and this would do that for me. 5, does student success on our common assessments translate into success on other high-stakes assessments? So if we took other high-stakes assessments, for us, that would mean our midterm or end-of-year exam. I definitely think there would be a positive correlation, and it would translate into success, because we would be assessing them in a similar way and using the same standards. So I would say yes. So these are questions that you are going to want to consider while creating your common formative assessment, but also after you have administered them and analyzed the results with your PLC, you're going to want to be going over the questions again to reflect on truly making sure that these are valuable and effective assessments that you've given your students. Now that we have determined the validity of the assessment, let's get down to the 4 steps of creating it. Step 1 is to identify the essential learning. What is it that we want our students to know? We have to determine that before we can create our assessment. So I've determined that we would want our students to be able to make plans with another person. Number 2 is assemble and review test items. So the team is going to review these potential test items that they create, compare them to the standards that they are assessing, and determine the quality of their product. They also need to assess the testing method. So are you doing multiple choice? Are you doing essay? For me, we're doing neither. We are doing this dialogue that we're talking about because that's the mode of communication that we're assessing. So it really is up to your individual situation. Step 2, assemble and review test items. So you are going to get those items together, determined by your standards, and you're going to compare them to your standards that you're assessing, determine the quality of the product that you together have created. You also want to determine the testing method that you are using. Are you using multiple choice? Are you using essay? Are the students later going to be assessed in a similar method? Because it should be in a similar method. Number 2, for me in my example common formative assessment that we're creating are what are the things that students need to know to be able to make those plans. So my students would need to be able to show me that they can discuss time, form questions, talk about their interests, tell me what they want to do, what they have to do. Those would be our testing items for our dialogue. Step 3 is design a scoring tool. So you and your PLC together will create a common rubric that would be used to score these when you do that collaboratively. For our example common formative assessment that we are using, our scoring tool, our rubric, will be based on the AP German exam, interpersonal speaking rubric, and we will then apply our standards for making plans to that rubric so that students have an idea of where they will end up in AP German, that we have high standards for them, and that we know where we want to get them. Step 4 is to anchor the work. Anchoring the work means that we are going to look through the student work, and we're not going to grade it yet. We are going to describe it with our colleagues. We're going to describe what we're seeing, and then together we're going to sort those student samples into low, medium, and high responses. That's before we can score them independently. We need to determine what is low quality, what is medium quality, and what is high quality. So let's go ahead and apply this concept of anchoring the work to my example interpersonal speaking common formative assessment that I'm creating for German 1. So on this rubric, the levels are 4, 3, 2, 1. So we would listen and look at our student work and determine what a 4, 3, 2, and 1 should look like when we see it. So we would need to find student work that looks like a 4, exemplary work. What does a 3 look like? A little bit less than a 4. And then 2, a 1. What should we be seeing from the students? We have to determine that as a group before we can then go and grade those student works. I have honestly never heard of or used the concept of anchoring our work before, but now that I know what it is and I know more about it, I feel empowered to bring it up and discuss it with my colleagues because it's something I've been curious about, but I didn't have a name to it. Because I have found that when I have discussed student work with my colleague, my German 1 colleague, for example, what I consider exemplary, what she considers exemplary, are never honestly the same thing. So this is such an important step in common formative assessments that you really have to understand before you can use them effectively. Here you see a link to a video that you can watch that describes the impact that common formative assessments can have upon your teaching and your students' learning. So you can see that here, and you can also click on it on the discussion board in Blackboard. Currently, at both of the schools that I work at, we don't have common formative assessments. Our administration has been pushing us and encouraging us to make common summative assessments, but we're not quite to the common formative assessments yet. But now I can go to my PLC and tell them that It's time for us to really start the process of these common formative assessments, and I have the tools to help us apply that. So I hope that you'll be able to do that as well. Please make sure you read Chapter 8 to really get a full sense of common formative assessments, and watch our videos. There are some incredible educators on there. Carolyn is now going to summarize a little bit for us and tell us a little bit about her experience.
Hi all, Carolyn here. I just wanted to take a couple minutes to share some of my ideas with you about common formative assessment, how it's used in my school, and ways that we have found to be most efficient and effective. So, my first step when you're creating your common formative assessment is be prepared. Just like with any great PLC, all members need to come to this meeting prepared with resources, questions, ideas, and be ready to work. Making a common formative assessment doesn't have to be hard. If every member comes with a couple resources ready to pool together, you can really put this together quite quickly and easily. My second step would be, make sure it aligns to the standard. You don't want to waste your time, your colleagues' time, or your students' time. Make sure it aligns to the standard so you can quickly assess and benefit your students so they can assess themselves how well they are doing based upon the state standards. Step 4 would be, check the rigor. There are many different scales that people use to check the rigor of their assessments. My school uses the depth of knowledge levels, and make sure that you're assessing your students at a level similar to what they're going to be seeing on their state assessments. That's one of the greatest ways to prepare them for what they'll be seeing. Of course, after you've created your assessment, it's time to administer your assessment. After you administer, make sure that everyone is on the same page when grading or checking your students' work. You want to make sure you're grading these equal across the board. So come together, decide how you're going to assess them, and then you can go back and make sure it's even. And most importantly, after you have checked all of your assessments, come back and reflect. Don't reflect upon by scores that your students have done. Reflect based upon, here were our problem questions, here were our better questions, here's where we need to go from here. You're going to get much more benefit out of it that way. So, I hope this was helpful, and you have great experiences using common formative assessment in your school.